Hi class, it's Mickey again. Today we are going to give the brief lecture on Jean-Paul Sartre's Portrait of an Anti-Semite. So, as always, feel free to respond in the discussion boards or to email me responses as usual. A couple of things. First, as a background, Jean-Paul Sartre is another one of these figures that in some ways is larger than life in philosophy because he's one who, like Socrates, like Epictetus, lived his philosophy. In this particular case, he was part of the French resistance during Nazi occupation of France in World War II. After, after the war ended and the horrors and the atrocities, the Holocaust became public knowledge, a lot of people were struggling with the question of how could this happen? The German people had a very high culture, tended to have very good universities, and yet there's this mass kind of coming together of willful ignorance. And so this led Sartre to start investigating um, how that could happen. And what we're ultimately going to talk about then is anti-Semitism as not in and of itself part of human nature, but as fulfilling certain desires and needs that are present in the lower parts of human nature. So that's how it fits into this unit. Second thing, it's important to remember, yes, Sartre is talking about anti-Semitism particularly, but the lessons are very important ones because, well, it's important for its own sake, of course, but he could very easily make the same arguments and the same observations about any form of bigotry, including racism, including the anti-immigrant propaganda we've seen spring up in the last 4 years, et cetera, because ultimately the same considerations apply. So if you're not that familiar with anti-Semitism, you can just as easily replace anti-immigrant vitriol and xenophobia and things like that. So very, very much relevant in contemporary U.S. Maybe even most recently, you've seen a lot of anti-Chinese bigotry due to the coronavirus. So that's obviously stupid and ridiculous. It came from a bat, not from a Chinese person. But anyway, so it still keeps popping up, and it'll probably continue to pop up for the reasons Sartre identifies. Well, they're fulfilling these certain types of needs in human nature. Now, that doesn't make it good, of course. Very, very clear. The fact that it is in some ways tied to human nature does not make it good. Instead, it makes it common and something we have to be very much on our guard against because it's very easy to slip into. That's the lesson we take about connecting bigotry to human nature. So, let's get started with that. I have to have my coffee. I think one of the things that I like that Sartre points out at the beginning is he refuses to call anti-Semitism an opinion. And it's interesting to stop and think about this. Why might someone say that? So what he says is because when someone says opinion, they're protected by freedom of opinion. There are cases where it's perfectly appropriate and allowed that everyone has their opinion, they could agree to disagree, etc. Sartre says, no, that's not one of these cases. This is a view that's doing active harm, is not justified by reason, therefore, it is not protected as an opinion. So, these are people who you shouldn't let have their say. And that might run a little bit counter to US culture. Very common in Canada, though. For instance, a lot of kind of anti-homosexual rhetoric you hear in the U.S. is actually illegal in Canada. It's considered hate speech because it's the kind of speech that can lead to direct harm. But anyway, so it's a bad thing. And the next thing we need to talk about is to expand a little on what I just said. Sartre says that anti-Semitism is a logic dictated by passion. And that's a funny sounding sentence, and it's probably stated with a little more shock value than needed. But what we really mean there is um, the dictated by passion. It's not reason that leads to these things. Reason does not support anti-Semitism or any type of bigotry. And why not? Because it doesn't come from experience. Roughly speaking, anytime you start a sentence with the word all and you're trying to talk about a group of millions of people, you're going to say something false. Unless you stick to biology. And this isn't biology, this is something else. So, anti-Semitism, bigotry in general, is just not supported by experience. We don't have experience that every Jewish person is this way, or every immigrant is this way, et cetera, et cetera. And so, as a result, as we're going to see, it's in an important sense chosen. It's desired. That's what he means by dictated by passion. It's something that certain people want because it fulfills an emotional emotional role. And so then you have this passion dictating the conclusion, and then we work backwards to try to build some sort of logic, some sort of justification for this view that is not supported in experience. So that's what he means by a logic dictated by passion. So, that being the case, uh, why might someone choose this or desire it? And this is the really important part for remember, Unit 3 is about philosophy and human nature. What desires and needs does anti-Semitism or bigotry more generally fulfill? And there's a lot of roles there. The first one he points out is that given certain structures we'll talk about later, if they're in place for the anti-Semite, they can blame this group of people on their failures. So, for instance, if I'm sitting around unemployed at home, it gives me some sort of solace to say, oh, it's not my fault I don't have a job, it's those damn Mexicans taking all the jobs. Even though, of course, I didn't actually lose a job to an immigrant. That's what he means by it can be used as an explanation for failure. Well, yes, I'm failing. Yes, I'm mediocre. Yes, I'm not doing anything with my life, but it's not my fault. It's group X's fault, and fill X in with whatever particular group the bigot's going against. So that's one of the big emotional needs, I guess, desires it fulfills, is you can explain your own failure this way. And then this leads to some other ones that we'll talk about later, but I'm going to try to go in order Sartre does. The second thing he talks about is there's an emotional state we all have, which is this fear of indefiniteness. All humans fear what is unknown, as Lovecraft said with a pithy quote a long time ago. The oldest and strongest fear is fear of the unknown. We want definiteness in our lives. We want certainty. But here's the funny thing. Remember the lessons we learned in induction. What is it that uses inductive reasoning? Everything. You don't even have a certainty that the sun will rise tomorrow from a deductive perspective. So when we're talking about the world rather than abstracts, the world does not give us definiteness. The world is indefinite. The world is not concrete. The world does not deal in certainty. And yet, that's a bad thing in some senses. We want certainty. And so the world we want doesn't match the world we are given. And so the anti-Semite bridges that gap by basically choosing certainty. They say, I want to be certain about certain things. That's terrible to say. I want to be certain about something, therefore I choose to be certain about it. And certainty of a certain group, or that group's responsible for all my ills. It's not supported by reason, we've already discussed that, but I can choose certainty and therefore, in some senses, have my emotional need, my fear of indefiniteness assuaged, etc. So that's the second thing, the choice of certainty. And here's the funny thing. Sartre says the anti-Semite knows they're doing this. they know their reasons are bad. They know that evidence does not support their particular brand of bigotry, and yet they choose certainty. And I think we see this in contemporary U.S. Uh, is that bigots and small-minded people, um, and even just generally ignorant people of certain sorts, they don't put themselves in a position to be challenged. So, the bigots are all sitting there blogging in their basement to other bigots instead of talking to an intelligent person who might challenge their views. And so, anytime we do that, anytime we try to protect and insulate our beliefs from those who might challenge it, we're ultimately choosing certainty. So, as an analogy, think of a deeply religious person who's not going to have a conversation with a well-informed atheist. It's um, They can choose to isolate their beliefs. Now, I want to be careful there. I'm not saying that all religious people are ignorant like bigots or anything. I'm absolutely not saying that. But what I'm saying is, you do see people of various groups will sit there if they want to be uncritical of their own views. They avoid people who would give such criticism. So, um, anybody with any belief they don't want challenged, they'll just not put themselves in a position to find it. And so the anti-Semite is being aware that they have flimsy reasons, but instead choosing certainty. Part of that choice is to position themselves in a way that the belief is not going to get challenged. And so notice that means they're connecting themselves to a group of like-minded people. Sartre says that they connect themselves to a mediocre community who takes mediocrity as a good. Now, what are they talking about there? There's yet another kind of natural need that anti-Semitism can fulfill, is this sense of community, and what Sartre talks about is hiding in a crowd. I actually got that phrase from Kierkegaard, but what's going on there? Well, first of all, of course, anti-Semitism and any form of bigotry does make a tight-knit community. Why? Because the view is irrational. They cannot be in community with somebody who's going to challenge that view, because the view will get shouted down. So instead, they collect into a view of like-minded individuals, and they can all feed off of each other's bigotry. That's part of it. But why does that make mediocrity a good? It goes back to the first emotional need that's fulfilled, that, well, we don't want to be responsible for our failures. And so if Group X is responsible for all my failures, then I'm not doing anything wrong. By just sitting there, by not doing anything with my life, this phantom group is stopping me. And so what ends up happening, and this is the next point Sartre makes, is that if anti-Semitism and all these semi-delusional bigotries were true, then let's say anti-Semitism, well, if everything is the fault of the anti-Semite, then I am good by definition. I misspoke there. If everything is the fault of the Jewish people, then I myself am good, am admirable, am valuable just by not being Jewish. And so that's why mediocrity becomes a good, because I am not, I am essentially born into value by not being of that group. And that's where Sartre says, well, that would only make any sense if there was what he called a metaphysical principle of wrongdoing. So let's take that in two steps. First of all, why would it have to be metaphysical? Remember, first week of classes, metaphysics deals with things beyond this world. So we already know that there is no, what you might call, physical principle of wrongdoing. That is, there is not evidence in the world to support anti-Semitism. So it cannot be a matter of the sciences. Instead, it would somehow have to be an issue of metaphysics beyond the sciences to say that somehow all of these people are definitionally wrong, bad, etc. And so it's only if we had that metaphysical principle that, if that were in place, then that means metaphysically, by contrast, I'm good by not being Jewish. That I am somehow valuable by definition, which means I don't need to do anything with my life. I don't need to excel, which is good because the Jewish people are keeping me from excelling under this crazy view, etc. And so that's where they get this sense of certainty, even though certainty doesn't exist in the world. That certainty would have to exist beyond the world in a metaphysical realm. And then that also allows my mediocrity to be a good thing, which allows me to hide in a crowd and say, and ultimately not face my own responsibilities. Uh, the final reason that this group uh, isolate themselves so much, that is, the bigot isolates themselves so much, is because um, there's a very real threat of their world crashing down. That as soon as I find out, say, for instance, oh, there are some Jews who are okay, or oh, there are some immigrants who are okay, or da 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 da, as soon as I find that out, that disproves my metaphysical principle of wrongdoing, which means as soon as that happens, I lose the claim to irresponsibility. That all of a sudden, oh, wait a minute, that means that that group is not responsible for all my failures, which means I am responsible for all my failures. And so we see this isolation and insulation from opposing views by the anti-Semite, and so that's part of the protection that allows them to keep using this irrational system to fulfill their psychological needs. So, probably worth summarizing. So, take it in 2 steps. Step 1, anti-Semitism or any form of bigotry is not justified by experience. Like any other group, there's good people and bad people. So, not from experience, not from reasoning, etc. But as soon as we realize that, that means that it must be the passion and desires that's somehow motivating this view. So, what desires and emotional needs does it fulfill? First and foremost, it allows us to explain our own failures without taking personal responsibility. It's not my fault, it's their fault. And further, we can do this by chosen certainty. It also takes away the indefiniteness that the world gives us. If I have questions about the meaning of life or value or what should I be doing with my life, those are, in a sense, assuaged. And so it takes away this indefiniteness, which allows me to hide in this crowd, this community of like-minded people, and therefore insulate my beliefs from being challenged, which is comfortable, although a form of cowardice, says Sartre. And there we, of course, can see Socrates sneaking in. All your beliefs should be challenged. And they're just refusing to examine their own beliefs under the scrutiny of logic. That's cowardly, says Sartre. He does not truck much with cowards. He thinks that we should always maximize the responsibility we take. If you had to summarize Sartre in a nutshell, it's maximum responsibility, minimum, and zero hiding from responsibility, i.e. cowardice. So that's what we're doing. That's the general picture with anti-Semitism, or again, more generally, any type of way. And we see, oh, it's the Chinese's fault, and that's why the government had a crappy reaction to coronavirus. I've seen that argument 10 times this week. It's a form of cowardice. It's saying, well, I don't want to hold myself responsible, so it's their fault. We've seen this in anti-immigrant vitriol, especially at the southern border from people in the north. Like someone up here's job has ever been taken by a Mexican. No, of course it's irrational, and of course it's silly when you put it in its bald face, and that's why the anti-Semite doesn't do that. They insulate their beliefs and protect them, and only share those beliefs with like-minded people. You ever Notice that? Like, nobody espouses racist views in public because they know they're going to be shot down immediately, instantly. And so instead, they'll feel people out and will only welcome them into the community if they're talking to a similar minded person. So, all of this is to say, Sartre does a very good job here in explaining why such irrational and silly beliefs persist. But what does that teach us? Because these are, that is, fear of indefiniteness, fear of mediocrity, fear of being ostracized from a community. These are all deeply embedded fears in human nature. That doesn't make anti Semitism okay. Of course not. And it certainly doesn't make it rational. Instead, it makes it pervasive. It makes it very common in places and ways you might not expect. And so the philosophical lesson to take from this is we have to be on our guard uh, permanently, always. Racism is not a thing of the past. Bigotry is not a thing of the past. Anti Semitism is not a thing of the past. It always crops up. We always must be on our guard to fight against it and to not be seduced by it. So that's the lesson we take from the Sartre. We don't say, oh, it's part of human nature, so I guess we have to live with it. No. It means we have to take stronger and more extraordinary steps to avoid it.